Well, I know that CityBiz has done another video on Outward Bound, but I'd like just to get a little bit in this discussion about what Outward Bound is doing now with the police force and the inner city students, because I think it's so powerful.
But, you know, our concept with Outward Bound originally had been to focus on inner city youth who may not be able to have an outdoors experience. Which at the time was new
to the Outward Bound.
We were the first urban-based Outward Bound center in the world. There are now half a dozen others here around the United States. But we were the very first, and we were the very first to focus on inner city kids to provide them with that outdoor experience. And it's always been our focus and continues to be our focus today. We ran other programs for kids that had the means to go on these programs, many times intermingling the two, which was a great experience for both. We ran corporate programs to help corporations develop bonding among their leaders. And we also developed programs with schools, whole schools that wanted to have classes exposed to an outdoor experience to bring the classes closer together. So we've been conducting those for a number of years, but a few years ago when we started having some problems in the inner city, we created, I guess it was about 3 or 4 years ago, we saw an opportunity to try to build a trust between the inner city kids that were going through the Outward Bound program and the Baltimore City Police Department, because there was a high degree of mistrust. And the Freddie Gray incident really exacerbated that. So under the leadership of the board and our now executive director, Ginger Mahalik, we started this program where we bring kids from the inner city, classes, schools generally, and we would put them together with cadets from the police department training program, and to try to get them to see that, hey, these are not bad guys. Not all policemen are bad guys. Not all inner city kids are bad guys or gals, you know. And they learn to develop a sense of trust. And so that, and then Freddie Gray came along, and the police department, working with Ginger and the staff and the board, decided to expand this to include all Baltimore City policemen. So we're running that program now, and everybody who is a member of the Baltimore City Police Department either has or will have to go through this program. And it started at the very top, where the chief and all of his senior leadership went through the program.
Paired up with an 8th grader.
Paired up with a 7th grader, 8th grader, 9th grader, usually a junior high school, rather than older or younger kids. And they spend a day together, going through a ropes course, going through all kinds of games where they had to rely on each other and they had to trust each other. And it's been, I think, very successful.
Joe, you mentioned Sally Michaels. There are other powerful leaders in town as well. Who, in your mind, were some of the great contributors?
Well, you have to start with Bob Embry. I think Bob has been the most significant private driving force behind a lot of what's happened in the last 30 years.
I happen to agree with that.
And you can't overlook Mark Joseph. Mark has been right there at his side and supporting most of the endeavors that Bob has either initiated or certainly has supported through his leadership of the Able Foundation. You know, then you have some of the ladies here in town. In addition to Sally Michael, there was a girl named Lainey Lebo who worked with William Donald Schaefer. She was on his staff, whereas Sally was a volunteer, but the two of them worked really hand in hand in driving a lot of the change for good that's happened in Baltimore over the years. So, you know, those are some of the private sector individuals. And behind the scenes, there have been funders that you don't hear as much about, but without their financial support, on a lot of these endeavors, they wouldn't have occurred. And I'm thinking of people that come to mind like Sue Cohen and Bob Meyerhoff and people, Bud Meyerhoff and people of that generation. Now, these are people, of my generation. Younger leadership has certainly come along, and you have to take a look at some of the people from T. Rowe Price, for instance, who have been very instrumental in leading change. George Roach would be one. George, and when he was the CEO there, was very active in the community. Brian Rogers, the most recently departed CEO, but still active there. The financial leadership really has
Chip Mason.
Chip Mason would be another. He was more my generation, but yes, and Buzzy Kromgaard when he was at Alex Brown. So you have to give these people some real credit for standing up and becoming leaders and bringing Baltimore into the 21st century.
Yeah. Well, when you left Alex Brown, you went down to the NASD, the National Association of Securities Dealers. It has a unique position legally and operationally in the financial services industry. How did you go there, and what is NASD all about?
Well, as we talked earlier, I'm a lawyer by training. I practiced law for 5 years, and then I got into the securities industry, fortunately, because it's a business that I loved, and never looked back at the practice of law. Among my responsibilities, both at Robert Garrett and Alex Brown, was overseeing the legal and compliance aspects of the business. So the securities industry was unique in that back in the 1930s, in the late 1930s, it looked at what was happening in the world, and the Securities and Exchange Commission was still then relatively new, having been created in 1933, and the Exchange Act was 34, but they were still in the early stages of developing the rules and regulations that would guide the future of the securities industry. And the industry looked at itself and said, well, perhaps we ought to be doing that ourselves. And so I think they were the first industry in America to really embrace the concept of self-regulation. And in 1937 and 38, the industry established a commission of which the chair was Benjamin Howe Griswold II, who was then the senior partner of Alex Brown and Sons. And they had drafted legislation which became known as Maloney Act, and which was adopted by Congress in 1938, which created the National Association of Securities Dealers as a self-regulatory body in order to oversee the conduct of business in the securities industry. And it was based upon the concept of just and equitable practices in the industry and fair dealing with your customers and your other peers in the industry. And so the NASD came into being in 1938. Mr. Griswold served on the board, but I don't think he was ever the chair. I'm not sure of that. And the concept of self-regulation grew and thrived. The SEC was happy to have that because they had limited funding from Congress. And so this was an entity, the NASD, which is the acronym for the National Association of Securities Dealers, and which also, by the way, stands for the first four letters in NASDAQ, which is where the name came from. So the NASD was funded by the industry, not by Congress and not by the SEC, and that grew, was successful. The whole concept of self-regulation caught on. Other industries embraced it, but we were kind of the role model. And over the years, there were basically, before I got there, 5 CEOs of the NASD. And I was happily working with Alex Brown. It incorporated, went public. Not necessarily a decision that I agreed with, but it did, and for good reasons. And so at the time, both of my daughters were in college, and I was then acting as the board chairman of the NASD. I'd gotten involved as a volunteer from the industry and had worked my way up.
Hearing self-regulatory
cases, cases that were being bought by customers against the member firms or a particular broker or dealer. And so that's how you got involved. You started sitting in and hearing those cases. My legal experience helped. We always had a public representative on those committees, in addition to representatives from the industry. And so I did that, and then I was elected by my peers from the Mid-Atlantic region to serve as the chairman of the district, which elevated me to the national board. And so I was on the national board, and in my last year there, I was elected as chairman of the national board. And that was in 1987, 86, 87. We'd had one former chairman for 17 years, Gordon Macklin, who actually was the father of the NASDAQ Stock Market, and we'll talk about that in a minute.
Remarkable man.
Absolutely remarkable man. And Gordon had been there for 17 years. I always called him the locust. He left after 17 years to become chairman of Habrack and Quist, which was one of Alex Brown's largest competitors and most
and best competitor.
And best competitor, yeah. As chairman, I created a search committee and people from the industry, and they conducted a thorough and complete search and came to me and said, "How about you? Would you be interested?" Well, they called me at a good time. A lot of change was taking place at Alex Brown. My kids were out. I had this yearning for public service. This was certainly quasi-public service.
Yeah.
So the whole combination of factors led me to accept the job as I guess really I was the 5th CEO of the National Association of Securities Dealers, which also at the time owned the NASDAQ Stock Market. So that's how I got there.
Yep. And then when you're there in that job at NASD, you've got a regulatory hat and you've got a market function hat.
Correct.
And those are 2 distinctly different businesses.
Well, at the time we didn't think so, but as the market operations grew into a real business, yes, it did. I mean, and when I first got there, NASDAQ was basically a quotation system. And it was
before the trade system, information before the trade.
That's right. If you go back to the history of the over-the-counter markets, the over-the-counter markets existed in the United States, well, going all the way back to the time that there were securities markets. But they were, as the name implies, over-the-counter. If you had to do a transaction, if you wanted to buy stock in a company that was in Chicago, and you were in Baltimore, you had to call a securities dealers in Chicago and get quotations on what you could buy that stock for or sell it for, and they were verbal. And then you had to relay them back to your local dealer in Baltimore, who then went to the customer and said, we think we can buy this at 20, or we can sell it at 19. So the spreads were pretty big at that stage in the game. And then by the time you got back to the dealer in Chicago, the prices may have changed. The over-the-counter markets existed in the United States, throughout the United States, and every significant city had its own local over-the-counter market. The New York Stock Exchange existed in New York, and it was a central trading floor where people came together and did basically the same thing that And the over-the-counter market was doing over the telephone throughout the country, but they were doing in a central location and really focused upon maybe the largest 1,000 companies in America, where there was another. In the over-the-counter markets, at one time there were probably 50,000 small companies where you could buy or sell their securities in these local markets. So the number of companies in the over-the-counter markets far dwarfed the New York Stock Exchange, but the New York Stock Exchange was the marketplace for the very large companies in America. And they were largely industrial companies, but and that's basically the difference. So in the 1960s, the Securities and Exchange Commission authorized a study of the over-the-counter markets in the United States and submitted a report to the NASD saying that we really need to bring some degree of centralization to these very fragmented markets. And it can be done, we believe, through automation. And so the NASD board at that time, under the leadership of a fellow named Stretch Gardner, who was the CEO of Reynolds Securities at the time, which became Dean Winter Reynolds and is now part of Morgan Stanley. They embarked upon an effort to do that, and they contracted with a technology company, a very prominent one at the time, Bunker Ramo, public company, to build this network of computers that are located in these centers. They were really not computers at the time, as you and I knew. These were screens. Terminals. Right. But they built a network that tied them all together. And that was the beginning of the NASDAQ Stock Market, which was launched in 1971 and was then owned by Bunker Ramo. But the NASD had an option to buy it, which they subsequently exercised. And the market was named NASDAQ, NASD Automated Quotations. And it was a central quotation source for people who wanted quotes from these smaller, mostly smaller companies around the country, where you could go to a central source and see on a screen, a terminal, a quote on any of the securities that were listed in NASDAQ.